So as Rob said, and as hopefully you all know, today's presentation is our topic is really looking at developing an office ergonomics program. And it's a discussion I regularly have with clients as I think there's value in having a formal program set up. And we'll talk about how that can be scalable. Like, if you're a small organization or a small municipality or a county that maybe doesn't have a huge workforce, that's going to be different than somebody who's got a couple thousand people that are in an office environment. But the information we're talking about today is applicable to all organizations. It's just how many of these components and how detailed your program looks will vary depending on the size of that organization. So kind of what I'd like to look at today at a high level, we're going to start by talking about who needs a program. I think that's a good starting point. We're going to look at what are some of the things that you should have in terms of documentation to support your program. And again, that's going to be relevant to everyone. And then we're going to start looking at some of the elements that should be present in a program. So hazard identification and controls. We're going to look at training. We're going to look at roles and responsibilities of various people that would be connected with an office ergonomics program. We're going to look at how we can evaluate a program to look at measures of success. And then at the end, I've got some resources that I'll be showing you and that Rob will share with you after today's presentation is done. And then we'll open it up to some questions and hopefully get some good dialogue going there. So we won't need the full hour for the presentation itself. We should have a good few minutes for questions at the end. All right, so who needs an office ergonomics program? Well, I guess the first group would be anyone that has employees in an office environment. And regardless of what you're doing, and certainly when we talk about municipalities, I know they've all got folks that are in an office environment. So if we've got office-based employees, we would certainly be someone who could benefit from an office ergonomics program. If we have identified office ergonomics hazards, so if as part of looking at our hazard assessments and we know that we have some issues potentially in the office, again, that means you're a candidate for benefiting from having an office ergonomics program. If you have claims associated with office workers, although that's a lagging indicator, that would be something else that's kind of hinting at the fact that you would probably benefit from an office ergonomics program. Now, we may have people who have claims and are dealing with stuff that would benefit from a better ergonomic setup that the cause might not have been the work environment, but they could still be aided by having a better setup and having a process in place for accessing some help. So I wouldn't rely on just having claims as being the tipping point when you go, okay, we need to have a program. There's benefit to certainly doing that ahead of time. So if you said yes to any of these items, you would benefit from having an office ergonomics program. And what I would say from the outset, and you'll hear me kind of repeat this a bit throughout the day, is it can be scalable. And as we talk through the different elements, I'll be pointing out things that are kind of must-haves and things that as you get bigger or your program's a little bit more mature, you're more likely to have. So, one of the things we see when people come to us and ask for help in setting something up is sometimes there's a bit of embarrassment that, oh, you don't have anything, we're starting from scratch, and that's okay. At least if you're making the effort to put something together, you'll still benefit from that. So there's lots of places that don't necessarily have a formal program, or they might have bits and pieces and it's not sort of cohesive, but you can still use those pieces to move forward. And one of the things I want to address kind of at the outset here, because you might hear me kind of interchange terminology as we go through this. So some organizations, they'll talk about an office ergonomics program. Sometimes it's a standard, sometimes it's a policy, could be a system in some places. There's some semantics around what those different things are, and they could all mean similar sorts of things, and we're just using different terminology, but it really is having a structure around how we deal with office ergonomics issues. It's no different than a health and safety management system. It's to put a structure in place so that we have a way of dealing with things as they arise, and we identify them before they become bigger issues, and we know what we're doing and who's responsible for different things. So whether you call it a program, a standard, a policy, a system, in my mind, that terminology is a little less important. It's that you're trying to put something in place. You're trying to put a structure around it. Okay. So what would be key elements that we want to see documented in an office ergonomics program? Well, the first thing would be some roles and responsibilities. And sometimes when I'm dealing with clients, particularly if they're a one-off client or a client that I'm dealing with, sporadically, often one of the challenges I run into is nobody knows who's responsible for what. So, I might be asking questions like, well, who do you get your furniture from? Or who's responsible for paying for this? Or, how do we make a decision around the furniture that we have, that sort of thing. And oftentimes I run into sort of blank stares and people can't answer those questions. And that's a good indication that it's not been defined anywhere. So having, knowing who's responsible for what, and we'll see some examples later in the presentation about some examples of how that can look is really important. Documentation around this will often have some definitions as well. All the definitions related to ergonomics that would be relevant to help somebody who's trying to understand your system or your policy, that they understand what all the terminology means. One of the most important things is, what is the process for accessing help? Okay, and again, if I'm doing one-off assessments with organizations, that's often the frustration that I run into with people is, hey, I asked for this like 6 months ago, and I might have gotten a call the week before, and often that's because there's no defined process for how to get help, who to call, who pays for it, all that kind of stuff. So having that defined is really important. And for some of you, if your organizations are smaller and you're not dealing with a whole lot of office ergonomics issues, it might be just knowing who you, like, maybe you don't have an internal resource that provides that help, but it might be having the name of an ergonomist that you can call when you do run into issues, right? And it could be that simple, right? And as you get larger, having some internal resources that can help you is important. And there's probably a few more steps to jump through before accessing that help. But at a simple level, knowing where to get help and who to contact, who's the appropriate person to contact, all that kind of stuff, that's a really important component of this. Now, the last two items that I've got listed here, furniture standards and equipment standards, are certainly helpful to an office ergonomics program, but they are more common as the program becomes bigger or as the program becomes more mature. And the analogy I'll use, or the question I'll ask you, is if you go to the grocery store without a shopping list, what happens? And for most of us, it's, we maybe go to the junk food aisle, or we forget the one item that we absolutely need. Same kind of thing happens if we don't know what we should be buying for furniture and accessories to help somebody get set up. And we run into this lots, where someone has purchased a new chair, but the new chair isn't really appropriate because the person purchasing it didn't really know what they should be buying. And then, they say ergonomics is expensive because they're now buying that chair a second time, and it's probably a little bit more because it's, it's got better features or whatever the case may be. So like anything, if you have defined standards and you just know that there's only a certain list of items that you can pick from, and if you know that the items on that list meet all the criteria that you need, having furniture standards and having equipment standards is super, super helpful. Now, if you've got an office that's got 20 or 30 or 40 people in it, you might not get to the point of taking the time to developing an ergonomic standard for furniture and equipment. If you've got a couple hundred people or more, and you're regularly having to buy product, there's obviously more benefit in having those standards in place. So if you don't have standards around what you're purchasing, that wouldn't be abnormal. So don't feel bad about that if you don't have those in place. But the more frequently, or the more frequently you have to purchase items, and the larger the organization you are, there's definitely huge benefit to having those in place. And that's something that a professional ergonomist can help you develop. That's something you can kind of learn if you have them in doing individual assessments. You kind of see the types of products that they're recommending. And, if you ask questions around why those are being recommended, or you can figure that out from the assessment reports that they've completed, they're probably going to be happy to talk to you about those items and why those items are better than maybe some of the items that you might have existing in your inventory. Okay, so as I said, all of these are things that we would like to see in terms of documentation around an office ergonomics program. Not everyone's going to have all of these, but the more of these you have in place, the more kind of mature your system is, and probably the more successful that it's going to be. Okay, so that's what we look for in terms of documentation. When we look at sort of characteristics of a successful program, in addition to having those in place, other things that we would look for, if it's reflecting the structure of the organization, if it's, if where certain roles and responsibilities lie makes sense from an organizational perspective, that's unique or specific to your organization, that's very helpful. In addition to having those roles and responsibilities, having definition around how we're keeping records, if people have assessments, if people have certain products that they need, should they have to move from one location to another. We'll run into this from time to time, where somebody has an assessment and then they move departments and there's no record of what was done, and then they have to have another assessment. Well, that's not really good use of resources or money or time of anyone's. Looking at those record keeping procedures is important. Having clear and measurable objectives for your program is also really important. So how are you measuring success, right? You should have some sort of a review process. Again, the bigger or more mature your program is, the more of this you're going to have. If you're doing 1 or 2 assessments a year, you're probably not going to have a giant review process. But if you're processing a number of these, you should be figuring out, is there something systemically here that we could be doing different to reduce the number of people we're seeing? If we can get those people identified quicker, that would be something else you would look for in a review. So there's definitely components that should be evaluated. And kind of the follow-up point to that is, have modifications been made to address systemic issues that you see? So easiest example I can give you of this is, we go into an organization, we do an assessment with somebody, and we see they're sitting in what's just not a great chair. And we identify that they need a different chair, and kind of look around and see, okay, everyone's sitting in the same kind of crappy chair that the person we've been paid to see is sitting in. And we say, Susie or whoever we're seeing would benefit from a better chair, but so would everyone else. We should have a discussion about this. Otherwise, we're going to be in here every week looking at the same chair, telling you the same thing over and over again. So there's opportunities when you look at things from a systemic view that will make things better in the long run. So we want to make sure that's something that you achieve by having a program. Whereas if we're just, Department A is requesting assessments, and Department B is requesting assessments, and Department C is requesting assessments, and we're saying the same thing over and over and over again, and there's no one looking at the big picture, that's where you benefit from the systems view. And again, it's no different than a health and safety management system. It's the same principles. It's just very specific to office ergonomics. Okay, so other components that we look at, first thing we would be looking at is our active and passive surveillance. So one of the things here is really, trying to prioritize who gets intervention or where higher risk areas are. And organizations do this differently. We have organizations where they do almost like an audit of the furniture or the ergonomics, and we'd go in and take a global view of what the furniture looks like, how people are using it. We might identify certain buildings or areas have worse furniture than others, and that should be a higher priority. Or, we might identify that people have the furniture, but they're just not using it properly, right? So we've spent money on sit stands or really adjustable desks, and people aren't getting the benefit out of it, right? So, or it's how do you triage if you've got requests coming in all the time? So for some organizations, they might have like a self-assessment that they would use, whether that's paper-based or electronic. Some will use the online self-adjust tool that's available on the AMHSA website. That's a good starting point where people can go through and kind of try and help sort themselves out. And then if they're still having issues, they would have an assessment either completed by someone internally or possibly by an external consultant. And you might look at, that's maybe a way of triaging. If half the people or more are able to sort themselves out with a little self-help education, then that reduces the number of people you're having to spend more money on helping. So that would be a way of sort of triaging things. When we look at identifying hazards, it could be that you ask people to go through a self-adjustment. Could be identified during hazard assessments, walkthroughs. Could be done if we're getting ready to purchase new furniture, or if we're talking about, making a decision about whether we keep furniture if we're moving into a new building, that kind of thing. Those are all good opportunities to see if we've got any issues. And then we also need to know, how are we investigating people to put their hand up and say that they've got concerns. So that could be, again, sending them to a self-assessment. If you've got an internal resource, it might be having the internal resource see them first and then decide whether they need to see an external or a professional ergonomist. Again, it's about what is the process. All these things are what's our process. It's not, it's trying to get rid of sort of ad hoc or haphazard dealing with things when it comes to ergonomic issues. Okay. When we look at, once we've identified issues, we want to make sure that we've got a set of controls in place that are going to deal with the issues that have been identified. So, if you've got a set of furniture standards, that's going to be helpful. If it's, you're getting an assessment done and either an internal resource or a professional ergonomist has given you solutions, those are all good things. But then what are we doing with those recommendations? What's our time frame? Who's responsible for implementing these solutions? Is there a follow-up process? Has somebody circled back to the employee and said, okay, you got assistance, 2 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, whenever it was. Have you been able to implement the changes? Have the changes been successful? If they haven't, then we probably need to restart that loop and have that person looked at again for a follow-up. And we want to document all these items. So, and this would be an element that you would be able to include in your annual review. So let's say you had 10 people that were assessed, or it's 100, it could be whatever the number is, at an interval that you pick, maybe it's 6 weeks, we did a follow-up and 80% of them said things were better, 20% we needed to do a follow-up. And then you could, do another evaluation of, okay, with the follow-up people, how many were we able to satisfy and get rid of their issues with a second visit, that kind of thing. So really, again, it's documenting that process, and it's for having a process for closing the loop. And that would be no different than any other type of hazard that you identify. How did you control for it? What did you change? How do you document that? Let's learn from that and use that information moving forward. Other things where we can incorporate ergonomics anytime we're looking at new equipment. So I had mentioned previously, maybe we're redesigning a floor, maybe we're moving to a new building. That's a great opportunity to make sure that we have an ergonomist involved so that we're picking furniture and equipment that's appropriate for that new space. Okay. And, maybe it's not a new build, maybe it's just refreshing an area. Maybe we're trying to pick standards, making sure we have someone that understands ergonomics that helps identify products that are appropriate, whether it's accessories, chairs, furniture, whatever the case might be, is very important. And then the last item on here involving vendors and suppliers. So, an example I would use when I'm doing an ergonomics assessment for any of my clients, one of my first questions is, who do you buy do you have a list of products we can pick from, or do you have a particular supplier that you like to choose from? And then we want to pick products that meet our criteria. We don't really, we don't care where you buy it from, but that's a way of kind of working, again, together with the client to make sure they're getting products from where they want, and we're identifying products that are meeting our criteria. Now, if you have standards, I can tell you consultants love it because you give them a list and say, these are what we pick from, and it narrows, how wide we're looking at different products. And, there might be times where we need something outside of your list, but we're going to have that conversation with you. And otherwise, we're going to stick within the list. So again, having those standards in place, any ergonomist that you're working with is going to be quite happy to see those. Okay, so another component that is really important when it comes to ergonomics, and particularly when we talk about an office environment, is having training. And the different levels of training that we would get into, but with ergonomics in particular, oftentimes people have a lack of awareness around the general principles of it. And when you explain it to them, they go, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense. And it's logical once someone has been provided that knowledge, but until they have been, it is not common knowledge. I can tell you, I experience that every day when I'm doing assessments, and I educate people on what heights things should be at, and they, oh, I thought it should be this, or I thought it should be that. So training is a really important component of it. The example I often use is, I do a mix of work on industrial and office environments, and there could be long periods of time where I'm not on an industrial environment. And even when I am, I might be on a site very infrequently. So I'm not as comfortable with what the hazards are that are on those sites. And I make that very clear to whoever I'm with that, hey, I want to go home at the end of the day, but you need to help me identify hazards that I might not be as familiar with as you are. No different than people that don't have training in office ergonomics. If they don't know what height the monitor should be at and the chair should be at and all those sorts of things, they're less likely to set up appropriately. So having some training is certainly very, very important. And depending on what role the person has in an office ergonomics program, they need to know what their roles and responsibilities are. And we can see there's a bunch of different folks here, and we'll get into specifically what some of those responsibilities might be by role. But general office ergonomics awareness training for everybody would be really important. And then for people that have a more involved role, making sure that they have the training to be able to support the items that they're responsible for would be really important. So a good example of this, we have some organizations that will train either their health and safety people, sometimes it'll be facilities, sometimes it might be some HR folks, that they're able to do like an initial assessment with people. So we've got a 12-hour course or a day and a half long course where we train people to be able to do those basic initial assessments. And certainly we've got a few municipalities that have adopted that model where they've got some internal resources, and it's a great way to have access to resources internally and within your your building or your work group, and speed up access to some of that initial help. And so that would be an example of some additional training for people that are a little bit more involved in the program. So when it comes to roles and responsibilities, I'm going to go through kind of these 4 different groups here. Ergonomics program coordinator, that could be a number of different titles. The smaller the organization that you come from, that might be one of many hats that a person wears. Like, it might not be a full-time role, but ultimately we've got a program or system. Somebody's got to be primarily responsible for that. And then obviously we've got other folks that have a role in that as well. So if we look at that ergonomic program coordinator, or whoever's looking after that, they are going to make sure that if you have internal resources, that they've had the training and they're able to complete evaluation. They're not necessarily going to be the person doing that training, but they're going to make sure that people have received that training. They're going to be looking at, are controls being implemented in a timely manner? And that's part of that follow-up loop is, this person's probably not responsible for implementing all that stuff. There's other people that are going to be responsible for parts of that, but somebody needs to check and see that it's happening in a reasonable amount of time. They are going to be, responsible for, checking in where employees are reporting MSI signs and symptoms. They're going to look at coordinating training. So again, that could be for local area specialists, or it could be just for the general office population. Could be making sure that new hires have it as part of their orientation, all those things. And then they would be looking big picture at the program, at some of those metrics we've talked about that we talked about earlier. So that could be how many assessments were successful at the that follow-up, whatever interval you might choose. They might be looking at trends there. So like, are we buying a lot of chairs? Is it all small people that don't like our chairs? Is it all big people that don't fit our chairs? Is there a keyboard issue? They would look, and again, that's going to be maybe easier to do the more assessments that you have. You're going to have a little bit more data, but again, you want somebody kind of looking at this from a systems view, and it's nice to look at all of those at sort of one time. Whether that's annually or more frequently, again, it's going to depend on the volume of assessments that you see. Managers and supervisors, again, they want to, one of their responsibilities is certainly looking after health and safety for all workers. They are generally going to be the ones allocating some resources to this, whether it's, getting somebody internal to help, whether it's paying for a recommendation, any of those things, they are going to help facilitate. They need to show leadership by attending the training like everybody else, and participating, and and following the recommendations just like everybody else does. And I certainly run into instances where everyone will have appropriate task chair, but the manager, the supervisor in the area sits in a big leather boardroom chair, and they, oh, well, I don't really need that. I'm the manager, I'm whatever. Well, that's not really showing support for the ergonomics program. If a company or an organization has said, everyone needs a task chair, it needs to have the same adjustability, it needs to have all these features, and then you choose to sit in a boardroom chair, kind of doesn't send the right message. And then ultimately making sure that those control recommendations are implemented and that they're used appropriately. And like I said, it's easier to say, to encourage people to be implementing the recommendations if they're doing the same sort of things. So I think that's very important. When we look at medical management, so whether that's return to work advisors or ability advisors, whatever terminology that might be, you know, when we're dealing with you know, cases where there is some medical management, really good opportunity to have some interaction with the ergonomics program. And you know, sometimes people are coming back from a non-work related medical issue. Sometimes it you know, it might not have anything to do with their setup, but they would still benefit from having some assistance from an ergonomics program. And that could be different equipment, it could be modifications to what they're doing, and it might be just making sure that they're set up as best they can be. It might not be that they need anything special, but this is certainly an area where I see lots of opportunity, and where I often see, as an ergonomist, we're not involved until maybe a second or third attempt at a return to work, which is unfortunate, because most often if we're seeing them on the second or third time, we're identifying issues that, had the ergonomics program been involved earlier on, they probably, you know, it wouldn't be the second try or the third try. They might have had more success the first time around. So I think that's an important opportunity to note. And then the employees themselves, great opportunity to have them engage. So, you know, if you've got some self-help available, whether that's a checklist you give them, or, you know, you access the online self-adjust tool on the AMHSA website, those are good opportunities to get that person, those individuals, to take some ownership for their own health and safety. And you know, they can certainly be involved in helping to identify solutions. Most of the time when I go in and I do an individual assessment with somebody, I ask them what they think would be helpful, and 80 to 90% of the time they've got the right idea. They might not know the exact product, but they understand where their issues is. Not everyone, but certainly can be helpful. Another good opportunity is, let's say you identify that, you know, the chairs you currently have are not the best, and you want to pick a new standard. You know, in addition to getting some advice on what that chair should have in terms of features, which you would, you know, probably look to a professional ergonomist for some help with that, there's still an opportunity to test and trial that equipment. That would be a great way to engage your frontline employees, to get them involved, get them testing it out, and then, you know, they feel a little bit more engaged in what's been done. Okay, and then you know, if you've got people that have been trained as local area specialists or local area contacts, ergo team members, whatever the case might be, they are really helping with the delivery of that office ergonomics program. So they'd be different than your individual employees, but again, it's another way of getting people engaged and involved. So when I look at, so those are kind of the main elements that I would look for in a program. When we look at evaluating a program, there's different things that we can look at that would be more leading indicators. So, you know, things like getting credits for, should be lead, not lead, lead or well. These are new different classifications for buildings that there is the possibility of getting an ergonomics credit for. Looking at audit scores. Symptom surveys are a really good way of kind of getting a sense of where people are. As we'll talk about here in a minute, you know, when we've got claims, that's a lagging indicator, something has already happened. If you've got people, like if you've got a floor of people where you've heard some concerns and you run a symptom survey and you look at pain and discomfort, quite often, you know, the higher your discomfort is, the greater the likelihood that there's an issue associated with that. And we get pain and discomfort before we have injury generally. So that can be a good way of checking if there might be something before we have some formal claims. And it can support the kind of the justification, combining some of that subjective information with some objective information regarding, you know, whether a piece of furniture equipment meets standard or not, can help build that case for making change. You can look at, you know, how many people have gone through training, or if you're using some online tools, how many people have completed that. And again, surveys are another way of getting a sense of how happy or unhappy people are with their furniture. And then when we look at lagging indicators, this is basically all, this is things that have happened and we already know we've had a problem. So those are not what we want to be using to lead our program. We want to use some of the more leading indicators, as you saw on the previous page. Another, and this is a resource that I'll get Rob to send out after we're done today. Cree Primus, which is a group in Ontario, has put together a musculoskeletal disorder prevention program checklist. That's a mouthful. So an MSD prevention program checklist. It's a 2-page document. I'll flash the two pages up here, and like I said, Rob will send out the PDF when we're done here. But so this is generic to an MSD prevention program, which really an office ergonomics program is the same thing. It's just geared to the office environment. If you went through this checklist, it would give you a good idea as to where you're at or where you've got some gaps in MSD prevention. So if you're looking for a resource that's published, that's out, that's free, that's available, and like I said, Rob will send through this checklist. I think it's a really good resource to look at where you're at, maybe identify some gaps, and give you a starting point for where you might want to look at supplementing or adding to your program. So last thing I want to go through here, and then we'll open things up for questions, is looking at sort of this idea of scaling or how mature your program is. So early program, if our program development is early in its stage, or if we're in a smaller organization, it might be as simple as when we have an issue, we call a professional ergonomist and they deal with it. And that's fine. That's certainly one way of dealing with it. It tends to be more reactive. It's not as proactive. And again, depending on the size of your organization, that's not necessarily surprising. As your program matures, or if you're a more into medium size of an organization, you might have some internal training resources available. You might have some standards identified. You may still call a professional ergonomist when it's needed, but there's a little bit more of that infrastructure there. And then as your program matures, or if you've got a larger group of office people and you have more of these elements in place, you've got a more well-defined process. You might have some internal resources to complete ergo assessments. So it might be some of you as safety professionals that you're doing those first assessments. And then if it's too complex or it's a medical case, maybe you kind of call your friendly local professional ergonomist and get them to do it. And you've probably got more of the elements that we've talked about today in place. Okay, so I think this is kind of a quick way of thinking about it. And like I said, it's dependent on size of the organization and maturity of the program. And it would really, you could think about that the same way as your health and safety management systems. Some of your systems are probably newer, some of them are more mature. Some parts might be more mature and other parts need work or development. And it's one of those things you have to work at, right? You get some things rolling quite nicely, and then other areas might need more attention. So, this would be, I would think about it in kind of the same terms for an office ergonomics program. So in terms of resources that we'll share after today, so I've got a 1-page office ergonomics checklist that my company has. It's freely available on our website, but I'll get Rob to send out a copy. So that's a, if you don't have a checklist or self-check that you use already, that could be something that you might ask employees to fill out initially if they're having issues, and then you might still follow up with them, whether that's internally or externally, but that's a good kind of starting point. You've got access to the online office ergonomics training, which EWI has developed, but it's available through the AMHSA website, and maybe Rob can talk to that here in a minute when we get the Q&A going. And then we've got the Pre-Primus MSD prevention checklist, which I showed you briefly there a couple minutes ago. And again, Rob will share a PDF copy of that. But again, you can find that out on the web as well. So I think those are all things that, in addition to kind of looking at the content of what I presented today, that would give you, a good kind of starting point to look at where your program is at. We have organizations that will come and have us do an audit of kind of where they're at, and then some organizations will write a program and ask us to give them feedback. Some organizations will say, hey, we don't have the time or the resources to do this. Can you write us a program? And we would take kind of their standard format and the general content that we would include and kind of mesh those two together and work iteratively with that organization to firm up their program. We can also help with the training of internal resources, and then obviously when organizations need professional assessments, we can help with that as well. But that is it for me for content. I'm going to turn my